Okay, in this video I want to talk about the abuse of power of police authorities and what insights that can give a person about systemic abuses within government power. This is going to be a video that kind of has morphed in my mind a couple times on what I wanted to talk about. Initially, I wanted to do a review on a book, and the book that I like to, the kind of was the genesis of this is The Police Code of Silence, Walking with the Devil, What Bad Cops Don't Want You to Know and Good Cops Won't Tell You by Michael W. Quinn. See right here. And I heard this book reviewed on Cop Block. See, it's a fairly thin book. Pete Eyre did a video having reviewed the book, and he apparently attempted to contact the author and talk to him. I don't know if that ever happened or not. Um, and this isn't going to be a book review. The stuff in the book is basically Michael W. Quinn is a former police officer. I think he served over 20 years, maybe 30 years, and it's a profession that he, um, you know, explicitly loves and thinks is great and necessary. Yet on the other hand, he provides example after example of personal anecdotes of outrageous violations of human rights and dignity committed by police that he has firsthand knowledge of. And what's more than that, the point of the book is to argue that these are not just a few bad apples, or his personal experiences shouldn't be represented. It is not representative of anybody else, but that it's a systemic problem. And now, the author, as far as I know, is not a libertarian, although he does have a default civil libertarian position when it comes to things like police brutality. Although I don't see there's any connecting that with broader political implications. It's interesting. People like the ACLU kind of get it right in a certain sense, but then they just don't follow their conclusions to their logical extent. But the more I thought about it, I thought about referencing other books. I think this is a really good um, visceral book that goes good with more empirical studies. Three other books that I would mention. One I did a review on, The Rise of the Warrior Cop by Radley Belko, which is a very good kind of chronology of the development of militarized police units, and um, a very good way to kind of show their escalation and how there's been mission creep, and how things like SWAT teams were initially said, well, this is only going to be a once in a blue moon for a very particular type of situation, maybe a hostage situation or something with a large group of armed assailants, something like that, a terrorist attack. Not something that you would be serving warrants with, not something that would go on patrol normally, not something that you would have in most places. It would be something for LA and New York. And even that limited scope was, you know, a radical departure from police practices in the past, and how that's become normalized and become considerably more. That book presents empirical evidence showing that the process of judicial review of warrants, of gaining evidence, when people say, I want a warrant, um, the judiciary will basically grant warrants en masse. There are, of course, some warrants that aren't granted, but most judges will grant almost everything. There are judges who will grant everything. It's essentially a rubber stamping process. The other two books are a little bit more theoretical. I don't know if I've done videos on them. I know I've recommended them before. The one I read earliest was called The Pursuit of Justice, and I read that several years ago. I don't have a copy with me because it's in Michigan. That's a very good analysis of how government police power cannot, and the government legal institutions can't really be objective or fair, that it has systematic bias. And another one is The Enterprise of Law, this book right here by Bruce Benson, I read a couple months ago. Again, shows some fascinating empirical research. Um, and I think the four books together make a really good companion set, basically on systemic abuse within the police department. And Quinn's book is not theoretical, and he doesn't, like I say, have any kind of libertarian leanings that are apparent other than basic, uh, you know, civil libertarian kind of ideas. But it really does help illustrate in a visceral way that maybe the theoretical works don't, what the incentives of a government monopoly on police protection and whatever, which is not exactly correct because defense is allowed outside of government, but um, the the creation of a legal double standard where you have an institution that both enforces laws, creates laws, and also arbitrates disputes with about those laws and without arbitrates disputes with its own personnel, um, is going to cause problems. And then I started to think, what's really interesting about this, I think why this is pertinent and why this is an area to explore more, is because it explodes one of the really common excuses, especially used by the left, by liberals, as to why government doesn't work. The left is not homogenous. I mean, they have uh, uh, quite a few different kind of subtle variations on what they believe and what they think. But one very common theme that goes through most, if not all, leftists is the idea that um, government is, at the very least, a necessary institution, um, something that is needed for different reasons, although there's a common trend of uh, selfishness is bad, or at the very least, selfishness is bad in certain situations, and that you need either people who are not selfish or an institution that is not selfish within society to do things that can't be handled by individuals who have selfish motivations. So a lot of liberals, for instance, think that you can't have healthcare services if you have any kind of selfishness. You need to have an altruistic person slash institution to handle healthcare. Otherwise, some type of you know judicial outrage or injustice will take place, or it can't even be done. And that's just one example. But um, most of these notions manifest politically in the desire for an institution that is meant to not to be altruistic and to not be self-interested and to be dedicated to some notion of the common good. Now, again, liberals vary in how they characterize the state. Some, I think, are delusional enough. Their arguments are predicated on the idea that it is actually altruistic, that members of the state are altruistic, that they don't act in their own self-interest, that they only act for the common good. There are arguments for the state that sort of necessitate that. If you're going to grant it, say, total power, um, you have to assume that that's the condition, because if it is a self-interested institution or or made up of self-interested individuals, granting it total power doesn't make any sense if you have a worldview that selfishness is bad. If it's bad to be a selfish worker or a selfish capitalist, then it can't be good to be a selfish politician or selfish government worker, especially if that institution is going to have um, extremely wide scope and their power. And most liberals think that it should. Of course, not all liberals think that everyone in government's altruistic, but they think that it ought to be, or that it needs to be. And they vary in how widespread it should be. I mean, some people think, well, it has purview within X, Y, and Z, but not necessarily A, B, and C. So you kind of have the more sophisticated economic arguments like, well, there's a public good problem, there's a free rider problem. You need an institution that can provide those goods and services, um, that has the attributes of a state that can compel payments, to solve the free rider problem, so to speak. And then you have others who think it should basically be doing everything or has a right to do everything. Now, what I think is interesting about the study of police abuses is that one of the common excuses given, because most people, very few people will say, well, the state is basically perfect as it is today. I don't know that many people who say, yeah, the system is flawless and it can't be improved upon. There actually aren't even very many people who would say that the system, as it's designed, is anything close to optimal. It's very interesting when people say, oh, you libertarians, you utopians, blah, 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 but very few people if you really ask them, are going to say, oh yeah, it's everything that's working right now is working exactly the way that it should or ought to or ever could, the best that it ever could. Um, but what a lot of liberals will say is they'll consistently point to problems in government arising from corporate uh, interest, that it is corruption of government by lobbies, by corporations, that is the cause of all the woes in government. Government abuse, because there aren't many people who will deny that there's any such thing as government abuse. There are some. There are I mean, I've had people argue quite seriously, philosophically, that whatever the government does is syllogistically the will of the common people, of the people in general, and is syllogistically good. Anything that it does is right. I have had people argue that ad nauseum. Like they believe that absolutely, totally. Anything that happens is moral. Anything that happens has the sanction of society. But interesting though, that's mostly for the government. So if I get away with something, that's not the sanction of society. But if the president does, then it is. It's not clear how that really makes sense. But not many people argue from that. You know, most people, most liberals included, will say, "Oh, there's an abuse. There's an abuse. That's a problem. That's a problem." In fact, a lot of them kind of make a political career out of pointing out what they think are abuses and trying to well, gaining social status by being perceived as crusading against those abuses, or actually trying to change them. I mean, there's a lot when we're talking about altruism and philanthropy and making society better. There's an awful lot of moral licensure. People who want to be seen to doing something right, but aren't actually that interested in doing it right so much as being seen as doing it right. Michael Humers wrote about this. A lot of people, this ALS bucket challenge recently has kind of swept the nation, and a lot of serious philanthropists have kind of looked at that and pointed out, hey, giving $10 or $100 or whatever one time because you do that is not serious philanthropy. That is to show everyone, that is to be seen as being philanthropic without ever doing that. And there's obviously a huge amount of that goes on within liberal politics, liberal political identity. A lot of people who they don't actually do things, but they feel like by voting for a certain politician or expressing favor for taxation or redistribution of welfare, that is, by itself buys them moral points that they're a good person for doing that. Now, not all liberals are like that. There are liberals who get down and dirty, who do actually go and try and help people they think need it, or who do actually honestly attempt to reform a system in a way that adheres to some kind of Benthamite notion of the most good for the most people. I think that's a really, really small minority, but it does happen. And of course, it's not necessarily even a thing of every person is either or. I think everybody has a mix of the two, but in most people, the mix is going to be overwhelmingly moral licensure, and only a minority of the time are they actually going to be interested in really doing something that's actually going to help. And Michael Humer again points out the absurdity of this in several of his writings. Like it's almost like saying, I'd like to be seen as being a good doctor, so I'm just going to go and cut you up. Like that's not really, you're not really doing the person any favors unless you actually try and analyze what if your surgery is doing any good or not. And unfortunately, so much of what liberals believe is what looks good or what sounds good anyway, without even really looking at it. Be that as may, when they do find abuses, there's a catch-all. This is corporate corruption. This is a self-interest of private parties, of private power, of private capital, of capitalists, and this is just repeatedly. You can't go to any video that outlines government abuse and not see this in the comment section. You can read articles about it. You can read books about it. The kind of escape, the catch-all escape. People accuse libertarians of saying, well, there's not a free market, hence that's why there's a problem. Okay, fair enough. If the libertarian critique of society only went that far, it would be a valid argument. But everyone kind of has this way. I don't know if there's one that says catch-all for the Christian, like right-wing people. Maybe that we've got away from God or we're not following the Constitution. Yeah, that would probably be the one for them. But with the liberals, here's the corporate corruption, corporate lobbying. If you watch the newsroom, classic example, like the big banks lobbying for the repeal of what was it, the Dodd-Frank, no, I'm remembering that, the Glass-Steagall Act, excuse me. That's the whole, yeah, the whole problem with the economy is because of that. Even though there's a 10-year lag and all that, and Ivan the Heathen did a great video detailing all about that. But at no point, the people who point that out, they never say, "Look, Bill Clinton was a bad president. The government's corrupt." Blah blah blah. It's lobbyists that corrupted their purity. And what I think is really telling and really important about these police's abuse is that they demonstrate systematically that police personnel, and this is from beat cops all the way up to heads of police unions to politicians, are acting in a selfish way, a self-interested way. And also, it's very hard to peg this to corporate influence. When a cop kills a person, say a minority in Missouri, and then is not prosecuted for this, is not harmed, gets away with it essentially. It's very hard to say how that's the fault of Wall Street. That some lobbyist is to blame, and it's fascinating how outraged liberals can get about some of these interests, and it's very selective in what they get angry about. I'm not sure. There's a tendency to really focus on something that might have a racial element, and I'm not saying there isn't a racial element, but that's clearly not the only thing going on. Police abuse is um, not what's the word, restricted to just white cops hurting black people. That's not the extent of police abuse. It goes much further than that, and these books demonstrate that repeatedly. Um, and it's actually, I mean, the idea that cops wouldn't be corrupt or self-interested or incentivized to commit abuses, it's almost impossible to not be the case. Let's take an analogy, and I've used this analogy before because I think it's a great one. Let's take an evil corporation that liberals love to hate and give it some of the attributes of government and ask, if this would be better. So let's take Walmart. And I did a whole video, what if Walmart ruled the world? And then the Sauce copied me and he made a video about the Smiths where he just took my exact same arguments and repackaged them and stole my intellectual property. But anyway, let's say Walmart now has some of the attributes. We won't even give it all the attributes of government, but let's say that it has the right to arbitrate disputes, not only within Walmart employees or people who come in voluntarily, but anybody who has a dispute with Walmart, they're the arbiter. If you and Walmart get in a fight over maybe your car got damaged in the parking lot, or supplies or equipment that you bought there was faulty, or you slipped and fell on their floor, or you were roughed up by one of their security guards, whatever it is, could be minor, could be major, it's irrelevant. But at the end of the day, it is a Walmart appointed and paid judge working in a system of laws created by the Walmart legislature. The corporate heads of Walmart, go and they, every Walmart store sends one representative to the Walmart Congress, and they get together and they say, here are the rules. And then the Walmart judges interpret those rules and pass judgment based on those rules. And when you go to the Walmart court, they summon you. You have to go. If you don't like Walmart, or you say you don't even think you've ever been to a Walmart and you don't even have any business with them, they can still summon you and send agents to go to your house and bring you in. And you can only defend yourself using their rules. You can only use a Walmart-approved lawyer. And, what do you think? Walmart is going to become a better institution that serves its customers better because it has these attributes. And that's without granting them, say, the power of tax, although the power to arbitrate their own disputes is actually de facto the right to tax, because they could just come to you. You could be minding your own business on a farm place 100 miles from a Walmart, and they could show up and say, you owe us whatever, $10,000 for goods and services, and you can say, I've never been to Walmart, I don't owe you anything. And they'd say, well, let's take it up, let's take it to court. And you go to Walmart court, and lo and behold, the judge finds that there's an implied contract with Walmart that you owe, because even though you didn't use Walmart, some of the other goods and services that you used had equipment that directly or indirectly came from Walmart at some point, or maybe you went to a business where some of the other customers of that business worked at a Walmart, and so some of the money came from Walmart. Whatever, it doesn't really matter. If Walmart gets to control the courts and Walmart gets to control the laws, then they can reach any conclusion that they want, uh, even regardless of their own law. I mean, you can look at their written, what they've said is the law, and it's irrelevant because their judges get to interpret that law. And who would argue that this will make Walmart a good thing for society? That it will make it, will that make it more or less likely to abuse what power it does have? Um, which is not to say it has limitless power in this circumstance, because the government doesn't have limitless power. But is it more or less likely to abuse people? Now, if Walmart was perfectly altruistic and perfectly good, and never did anything wrong, and never had any motivation or desire to exploit people, then the fact that it had all these powers would probably not change very much. Okay, is that a very fair assumption to have? No, it's not. Now, if they have any kind of self-interest, if they have any kind of desire for betterment of themselves, even if they have no malicious intent towards you, if they don't want to hurt you, but they want to be as rich as possible, or they want to be as prosperous as possible, or they want to be seen as being then they have an incentive to use those powers to their own advantage, to your detriment. And who's to say they won't? Because they have, and it's very odd that, well, that would be obvious to most people in the case of Walmart. It is decidedly unobvious. In fact, it's flatly denied in the case of government. Oh, they won't abuse the extra social powers they have, the legal hypocrisy, the legal double standard, uh, which is so characteristic of government. Um, yeah, in that case, it's not a problem. In fact, it's a virtue. It's something that it needs. It's a characteristic that's necessary. But you got to understand that with that characteristic, you can't predicate an argument for the state on it having characteristics like this, and then say, but those characteristics will be kept in check in such a way that they don't cause abuses that outweigh whatever supposed benefits. Because I haven't seen it. I mean, I haven't seen these abuses. It's funny how people like to characterize government abuse, and they try and say, oh well, it's oh, here and here. They're very isolated anecdotal examples, but it's systemic. So look at police. The government does not record any statistics on the number of people who are killed by police officers. And John Oliver, I believe it was, did a really great rundown of this information. There are researchers who are trying to figure this out, and the government does not track. Now, they track everything else. They keep track of all kinds of things, and you would think this would be a relatively simple thing to keep track of, but they don't, and they won't. And there have been people who have lobbied for and attempted, even people within government, who have attempted to clear this issue up, to say, how often do police kill people? Which is not to say they're necessarily committing unjustified homicides all the time. It's to say it would be good to know, right? We know how many other homicides there are. We know how many people are killed by baseball bats and by AR-15s, and how many people are killed by Mossberg shotguns, and how many people commit suicide or drown in pools or fall off their bikes or overdose on drugs. We know, they keep track of that. Of course, there's probably people that they don't know, but they try and keep track of that. CDC, the FBI, all these organizations keep track of that, but they will not keep track of the number of people killed by police. Now, is there any kind of reason for that from a most good for the most people? Is there any kind of way we could say that's got to be corporate influence? That's corporate corruption. That's got to be it. It can't be. There's no way that's because they're self-interested and they're trying to minimize, or conceal the costs that they place on society. I mean, who could argue that that's what's going on here? Oh, they don't have the money. I mean, like, that's the other thing. Oh, yeah, their budgets are so tight. There's just no way they could handle, the burden of doing that. They can't. They won't even keep track of how many times their firearms are discharged during their duties. There have been people who have tried to settle for that. There have been people. Radley Belko talks about. I think he was a mayor in Maryland who was the victim of a warrant of a drug searching raid that found nothing but killed his dogs and ransacked his house. Not so much as we're sorry, wrong place. He tried to get legislation in Maryland to count how many killings were done by the police, and they wouldn't hear it. The police unions, nope, 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 nope. Then he tried to get how many rounds they discharged. Nope, nope, none of that stuff. They won't cover it. And it's like, well, why not? Why? What's the who's the fat cat capitalist who is, is it the Koch brothers? Is this the Koch brothers? And this must be the Koch brothers. It's their fault, right? They're the reason that this happens, right? Is this the reason, cops get slaps on the wrist or nothing? And it's very fascinating, by the way. What was really struck me about this book in particular, it wasn't the anecdotal stories so much as the level. He wrote this book ostensibly, he says, to other cops, and he's pleading with them on his hands and knees to not, commit murders, to not do derelict things, to not rob and steal and kill and rough up and falsify evidence and falsely arrest. And it's very fascinating. He doesn't plead with them from the point of view of these are morally wrong and you shouldn't do them, or it's a violation of the trust people put in you, or it's a mockery of the trust that people put in you. All this stuff about the cops and robbers and the good guys and the bad guys, and we're here to protect society, blah, 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 blah. And yet you're predators most of the time, or much of the time, or at least some of the time. No, his rationale why they shouldn't do it is because it's dangerous for them. He's like, I don't want to hear about any more police who die because they're drunk driving at 100 miles an hour in their squad car. As if the people that he could potentially harm by doing that are of no consequence. That the only negative externality from such risky and absurd behavior is potential harm for the police officers and not for anybody else. He says he doesn't want to see one more officer go to jail for misconduct or for falsifying evidence. Well, that doesn't happen very often, as he admits quite readily. So, the point of his appeal is kind of limited. It's kind of muted. Like, the problem is you guys aren't accountable, but please try and, act more accountable. Well, it just doesn't work that way. And, of course, many of the stories he talks about are just hilariously, if not tragically, infuriating. He talks about his first job as a cop. He was partnered up with this older cop, and this older cop would spend the first 4 or 5 hours of every shift getting drunk. He would get as drunk as possible, and then around 11 or 12 at night, then he'd actually start his shift after he was completely wasted. And after a little while of this, he went to his superior in internal affairs and said, I'm reporting him, I think this is wrong. And then he got hazed, and he got attacked. His internal affairs officer, who's supposed to police the conduct of the officers, felt it was the most outrageous thing. It wasn't that the one officer was a drunk on the job on taxpayers' money. He felt that the main problem was another officer had ratted him out. You're not a rat. And another reason I'm kind of making this video now is I stopped at a place to get some lunch, and there were 6 cops there in uniform with their guns, with their squad cars, and I got there, they were already there. I was there an hour, they were still there, sitting around on municipal dime, on our tax dollars, just chatting away with their friends. And I kind of have mixed emotions about that, because on the one hand, I'd rather they were sitting in a pizzeria or a donut shop or a fast food restaurant, or I don't know, fucking some boy they met on Grindr in the back of their squad car off some dark alley, than if they were out doing their job. Because doing their job typically means hurting people. I mean, the idea that, well, they're out stopping murders and stopping rapes, and well, they never intercede in those events, almost ever. I mean, it's probably happened, but it's probably less than 0.1% or some ridiculously small amount like that. They don't actively intervene. Their deterrent effect, it's there. It's kind of hard to calculate. It's probably not that high, because if it was, where there are more cops, say like in New York City or Chicago or LA or Detroit, where there's actually large numbers of police, you'd think that they would hence deter there being a lot of crime. And then smaller towns, smaller municipalities, rural areas where the police presence is minimal, even absent, then there should be really high crime, because there's no cops on the beat. There's no chance. Most of the places I've lived, there's no chance of the police showing up on scene within half an hour to an hour. And I don't even live in the most rural areas, and never have. So wouldn't those areas be ripe for violence, because after all, there's no police to stop it? I don't know if that's something that can actually be measured, but it just doesn't seem to be the case. They don't even catch murderers in half the cases. And when they do catch somebody, very often it's the wrong person. And you can say, well, that's an anecdote. That's an anecdote. Well, no, the enterprise of law says they've done studies, and it's about half the time, about half, 50% of an officer's time is spent doing personal errands, eating food, on the phone, talking to friends, blah, and again, that's better than them out roughing people up and killing people, or writing them citations or tickets for victimless crimes, or whatever else they're entitled to do by their job, which is basically everything. On the other hand, it kind of destroys. It's hard to say. Well, how is that like the influence of corporations? How is Wall Street to be held responsible for that? The clearly selfish, clearly uh, self-interested, biased actions of police. And it's an illustration of the fact that there are incentives and biases within government that go quite a bit beyond corporate abuse. And the thing is, corporate abuse, of course, it certainly exists, but like if we're talking about a corporation, changing the zoning laws so that they can build a factory and whatever, that's not good. That's bad. Um, but that's not as bad as like getting killed, getting gunned down in your home at night in a no-knock raid, or on the side of the highway, or getting, even more mundane stuff. I mean, the outrageous homicidal stuff that happens on a daily basis, essentially, but it's not the most common types of abuse. That's going to be just getting hassled for tickets, getting hassled for money, asset forfeiture. A huge problem that, how is that to be blamed on, some external capitalist influence on the otherwise altruistic institution of the state? It doesn't show, and it's very interesting. I think this is one of the reasons there's such a strong desire to place a racial element on these and say, oh, the reason this happened isn't because of systemic police abuse or brutality or anything to do with the incentives of the state. It's racism. That's what's really, it's always this, there's always some alien force, some alien parasite that's corrupting the state, but the state is actually a pure good organization that wouldn't actually do these things. And government workers, their service, they provide a service which is retarded. The person who works at McDonald's provides a service. The person, a baseball player provides a service. A person, anybody who engages in voluntary exchange is engaging in a service to others. Someone who is not engaging in voluntary exchange, somebody who is in a unilateral exchange whereby they take money from somebody regardless of whether they want it or not, they're not providing a service. They're stealing. That's theft. That's what that's called. And I don't want to get in the whole hullabaloo of why a state is not any different. Again, you'd have to come up with a different a rule as to why it's okay when a government does it, not everybody else. A rule that would be not usable by a third party. So I can't say, well, my friends voted, so I can go rob my neighbors, or I'm a good person, I have good intentions, so I can go rob my neighbors, or excuse me, tax. Um, no, it's very. I think it's one of the reasons liberals want to find a racial bias, a racist reason, because then they can skirt the question of the fact that there's actually a systemic problem with this institution that they otherwise consider an absolutely vital linchpin at the very least, and sometimes the ultimate goal of society. The state is either an end in itself, or it's the necessary vehicle for whatever ends it is they happen to believe in. The two are actually similar in terms of what they advocate politically, although they do have different ends potentially. Um, in any event, in either of those cases, though, you can't have there's no room in those zeitgeists for a state that has selfish interests. For a state that's composed of members that will do things for their own benefit to the expense of the public or other individuals. There's no room for that. So you have to pretend that it's a beneficent organization, and that it's only these corrupt elements within it that need to be abolished. If we could just get um, you know, if we could just do campaign finance reform, everything would be fine. If we could just get the lobby money out, and there's so many examples where clear malfeasance within government might be fixed by reform, and yet that's why the reform will never happen. I was having a conversation with my father, and he was complaining about how just having the two options is just too. It's great, and you're forced to pick somebody that you don't agree with, and I forget exactly what, but there's some voting reform you could do where maybe basically you don't have to be in a particular party, and it's just you don't have party affiliation, and it's just people candidates running, and there's no party affiliation, and you vote for whoever you think is the best, and there could be 20 choices and blah blah blah, and like, oh yeah, sure, that would give you more choices, um, but that would not serve the interests of anybody who's in government now. None. So it's never going to happen. And it's kind of like, I was like, do you seriously believe that they would institute policies that are demonstrably against their own interests? And the answer is no, of course they won't. And of course they don't. Even if a compelling argument could be made that it would be better for the public in some sense. And again, this is a demonstration that the state is not above humanity. It is not an angelic, uh, supernatural institution floating above. That there's nothing inherent within its construction. The legal framework within which it operates, or its physical institution, that means that people in it are not incentivized to abuse. In fact, it's quite the contrary. Well, there's nothing that makes people beneficent or benevolent. It certainly doesn't make them all-knowing. It doesn't make them altruistic. There's no part of its construction that does that. That rhetoric is useful. It's useful for them to spout that rhetoric to justify what they can do and what they do. Uh, but for them spouting rhetoric about how altruistic they are does not make them altruistic. Just like saying that you're a great person and that you care for the poor because you voted for a Democrat, that does not make you, that's moral licensure. That's not actually charity. That's not actually philanthropy in any meaningful sense. But what's so ironic is not only does the institution of the state not create, and I mean, I don't want to straw man and say that people allege that it will be completely perfect or anything like that, but largely, I mean, we don't have to predicate that it only fail. Like, it's one thing to say, well, maybe there might be some abuse, and that we can live with that, but you would have to argue that it would have to be overwhelmingly not self-interested. That it couldn't, if you start getting to a high percent of what they would call corruption, but what most people consider just them acting in their own self-interest within the institutional framework, provided. Um, it's very hard to conclude that it's a worthwhile institution. Um, if you're going to vest it with all these powers and with all these double standards and with all this extrajudicial authority, and it's not even like a monopoly is one thing, but to vest, it's the arbiter, and it's the provider of defense, and it's the legislator, and it's whatever. Uh, it's not just not good. It's bad. It's giving you every reason to push as hard as you can without causing some kind of revolution or whatever. I mean, there's still limits, but the limits are pushed as far back as ideologically possible. The limit, the scope to which they can abuse is quite extent. Goes really far, because the ideology allows for it. And I don't know. I think that pointing out, like police abuse, it illustrates a systemic problem that's mostly to do with incentives. There's also a feedback loop. I think with people like police, you get people who realize that they are, to a very large extent, above the law. But again, to take it to the racial element, what if people seem to complain, well, white privilege, blah, blah, blah. Well, what if there really was some serious white privilege? Whereas if a white person kills a black person, the burden of proof is on the black person's family to prove that it wasn't justified, right? And that the authority that decides whether it was a justified homicide or not. It's not some third party or whatever. It's the clan. The clan decides. Clan members. If a clan member kills somebody, then the Grand Wizard or whatever, the Grand Dragon, he's the one who gets to decide whether or not it was justified. Well, do you think that that would cause there to be more homicides or less homicides? Do you think there would be more abuse or less abuse in those situations? What do you think would happen to the attitude uh, of a clansperson or a white person, or in the real world example, a beat cop, when they realize explicitly sometimes, but implicitly always, that if I commit, if I do something, if I kill someone, the chances that there be any negative repercussions are greatly mitigated. They're not completely gone. They're not completely gone. You could still get murdered. You could try and kill somebody, and you may pick the wrong person, and you may end up dead, which he talks about too. He's tired of hearing these no-knock raids, people getting killed. Well, what do you think is going to happen? That's the risk. But legally, they don't face almost anything. They have sovereign immunity. All right, so they can't even be found civilly liable for what they do, and the courts and the police unions and the police organizations and the have all demonstrated that they place a huge burden of proof on anybody who levels accusations against a police officer or any agent of the state for that matter. There's there is an explicit double standard. It's expert testimony whenever a cop says anything, even when he's testifying in his own defense or against somebody else. I mean, it's it's absurdly obvious to anybody who looks at it that there's a double standard, and that double standard is going to be abused. It is abused, and that's what you see when you see these people. And that's not to say that every police shooting is, some horrible tragedy, and that the victim is some great person or didn't do anything wrong or sometimes didn't even deserve it. That happens, but it's not all the time by any means. Not even close to all of the time. And I just think that it's just very, very illustrative of a problem within government that is outside the myopia of liberals. That they are very well. It can't. Government is supposed to be this one way, and if there's anything wrong, it's from this one thing, and it's completely ignoring. Like, okay, that the Koch brothers do not explain Ferguson. And I know there's debate about that particular scenario, but it does not explain Rodney King. It doesn't explain no-knock raids. It doesn't explain why they won't keep track. I mean, is it the Koch lobby? The Waltons and the Koch brothers and Fox News, do they get together and go to the government and say, hey, let's make sure that we don't keep track of how many people police murder? Like, why is that such a big problem? Even John Oliver and all these, because it wasn't just him. The Onion, there's been a couple outlets that have kind of made light of this, and I think it's probably largely due to the work of Radley Belko, although I can't be certain about that. Is that because of some sinister capitalistic influence, or is it the self-interest of the government that's the most likely responsible for that? It seems like an obvious question. I mean, the answer seems like, to me, it seems self-evident, but apparently it's not, because plenty of people refuse to see the potential of that kind of abuse. Oh, if there's abuse, it's anecdotal. It's just a few bad apples, or it's influence from some other source. But what he points out, people say, oh, not all cops are bad. Well, yeah, because the kind of abuse that he talks about in his book, and that is empirically demonstrated in books like this and others, is systemic and it's widespread. Now, does every single cop ever always take part? No, that's not true. But it happens all the time. And the thing is, the other cops who don't participate in it, or who participate in it less, what do they do about it? No, it's the thin blue line. They don't report on it. They don't tell anybody. They don't confront their peers for doing it. They just get away with it. And again, why are they able to do that? What's the reason? Is it because of the free market? Is it because of Wall Street? Is it because some lobbyists got the Glass-Steagall Act repealed in 1998 or whenever it was? No, that's retarded. Like, that's causal gymnastics. Like, it's impressive that somebody can say that with a straight face. And I don't hear them say that, because I don't even see them confront the issue. The issue of police abuse is never, when liberals look at it, seen as police abuse. It's always racism. I guess they ignore all the white people who get killed by police, or when it's a black person killing another black person, or whatever else. I think they'd all do very well to read these books. Um, and you don't need like these books, but it's on the media all the time. Now the stuff doesn't make national headlines all the time, but locally it does every day, every day, every day. Officer killed, officer killed, officer killed somebody, or hit somebody, speeding, stealing, whatever else. Um, I've I've been solicited by sex from police officers while they were working more than a few times. I mean, they've been on there looking for sex, and they're supposed to be out there, what, protecting the public, but they're just a horny man who wants to have sex. They're not better. They're not like the fact that they got training at the academy doesn't mean they're not horny or that they aren't avaricious, that they don't like nice things, and that they don't. And then one thing it does, though, they're not so stupid that they don't realize that they can get away with things that the rest of us can't very easily. You know, if I shoot somebody, even in legitimate self-defense, there's going to be a microscope on me to find any potential that I did something wrong. It could even be national news, you know, if I kill a black person, especially. Um, if a cop does it, it's just another day. It just gets swept. It gets swept right under the, and like, it's very fascinating because like fictional and media portrayals of the police never really show this. It's very rare that they do. Dexter was kind of a rare example because there were a couple times, especially at the very end, and I'm not a huge fan of that show. I thought it was good at the beginning, kind of got bad at the end, but it's interesting. He basically commits a murder on camera in a police station, and basically the other police officers say, well, "You're our friend. If you say it was self-defense, then so be it." And that's, you know, that's all a cop has to say. He's got magic words. He can say, "I saw furtive movements. I was afraid for my life." That's all I have to say. You could have had your back turned, pushing a baby stroller, and they could shoot you 20 times in the back. They've had them been restrained in handcuffs and been shot in the back. They've had all this stuff, and they've even something. It was relatively recently. A teenager was in the back of a squad car, handcuffed, and he'd been shot like in the back. And they said it was a suicide. And when somebody asked, like the spokesperson, he says, "Well, I realize that's hard to believe, but that's what happened." Well, well, is that? I mean, who's going to come out and say, "Nope, that's yep, it had to be just the way he said"? And who's the judge of, you know? It's the whole Walmart running the courts thing again. Like, oh yeah, but these guys get acquitted, so you don't have a point because they've never been found guilty. They control the fucking process. What do you expect? Are you going to seriously tell me that if one institution controls the entire process, that it's going to be a fair outcome? That when they acquit themselves repeatedly, they don't acquit themselves every time, but systematically all the time, not well, over and over and over and over and over again, regardless of the evidence, regardless of the testimony. I mean, if you ever watch Waco: The Rules of Engagement, which I highly recommend people do, there's a part in that where they're having congressional hearings, and then Congressman, now Senator Chuck Schumer, gets right out there and says, no matter what the testimony, no matter what anybody says, no matter what evidence is presented, the police are heroes. The police did nothing wrong. And he didn't just mean the police. He's talking ATF, FBI, essentially, in that case. The foregone conclusion of this inquiry, of this, you know, supposed to find the truth, is that everything they did is fine, and no evidence, nothing matters. And there was, you know, the one thing I'll never forget Bob Barr, for all of his flaws, whereas he sat there, he didn't say that. He said, look, this, you know, like, rule of law, blah, 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 but he's the rare exception, you know. And the ultimate result of these hearings was nothing. Nothing was done to punish anyone in the government for anything that happened. And another thing that's kind of coming up here, I just watched a documentary, I forget what it was called. We watched it on Netflix. But it was about a man in Texas who was convicted of murdering his wife. And then he spent 25 years in prison. And then eventually, through DNA evidence, his lawyers were able to and it was terrible. His son, he had a little son who basically who believed his father had murdered his mother, and changed his name and said, "You're not my father. I don't care who you are. Get out of my life. I never want to see you again." Who knows what happened to him in prison? Um, and turned out that the police had exonerating evidence at his trial. They knew things that pointed to another person being responsible, but they didn't know who that other person was, and they did not have them in custody, and they didn't know how to find them, and they wanted to get a conviction. The district attorney wanted to get a conviction, and so they were going to get this guy, even though they knew it was not him. And he got sentenced to life in prison. To life. And they knew he was innocent, or there was a very high likelihood that he was innocent. And the Enterprise, or not the Enterprise, the Pursuit of Justice actually has a part where they talk about if you look at convicts who were later exonerated, who were found to be innocent, if you look at the date that they were convicted, guess what month most of them are convicted in? Wrongly, later shown to be innocent. It's in October. It's the month before the election. So prosecutors, they want to be seen to be catching somebody, and they don't care if they're throwing innocent people in jail. That does not. I mean, look, maybe they're prosecutors. This isn't the case. So, but many, many, many of them do. And the thing is, they suffer no consequences for this. Oh, sorry. Apologize about the 10 years. And, this guy's case, for most of the time he was in prison, it was, it was very open and shut. There was very little evidence that he had. The government had evidence that he was innocent, but that he could present, he didn't have very much. And as he started to get closer and closer, when it became mountingly obvious, not only that he didn't do it, but who did, then they started to offer him, it was very fascinating, they offered him parole. They said, you can go if you admit that you did it. If you admit your guilt. Or they said if you show remorse for your crimes. And they didn't do that until after it was clear that his lawyers had obtained evidence that he was innocent. Why would they do that? Why would they offer parole then? Obviously to try and prevent there being any, question of whether he was innocent or not, because he would be admitting guilt in that case. And I think in that case, actually, eventually, either the judge or the prosecutor, they were discredited. They put him on the stand, and he just said he didn't remember anything. They showed a video. I was like, well, do you remember collecting this evidence? I don't recall. It was a long time ago. I don't recall. 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 And I think he did actually get like a couple years in jail. Bullshit, though, for what he did to that person. That's almost a capital crime. Think about, they catch these guys. They have three women like caged in their basement for 15 years or whatever, and they're like the most horrible, revolting, reviling individuals you ever met. But this prosecutor sent at least one man to prison for 25 years, and he didn't even have to pay the cost of feeding them. The rest of us had to pay taxes for that, and he's not the only one. And what happens to them? Usually nothing. In this case, relatively speaking, a slap on the wrist. Is there a systemic incentive problem with government, or is this just some aberrant, like, oh, it's racism? In this case, there's no race. It's all white on white, everything. It's racism, or it's the Koch brothers. Yeah, between those two, that accounts for pretty much everything liberals see wrong with government. Those are the only two things that go wrong with it. And when you have a black president, nothing can go wrong because everything he does is not racist. So when he blows people up, that's not. I mean, it's insane. Anyway, those are all good books. The Enterprise of Law, The Pursuit of Justice, The Rise of the Warrior Cop by Radley Belko, and this is fairly short. It has some amusing anecdotes. He talks about they got a burglar alarm that they think went off at like a sporting goods store, and they didn't see any evidence of a crime. It's probably a false alarm, but they just proceeded to just rob the place blind, take everything they possibly could, and then divvy out fishing poles, whatever. Like the pettiness, and for every story that comes to light, I mean, every story you hear about, you only hear about some of them. So all the stuff that comes to light, you don't even hear about. You hear about like some sliver of it, but most of the stuff never comes to light. So the scope of the abuse, and this isn't even getting into the whole like victimless crime. They're writing you tickets. They're charging you with crimes for doing drugs or selling drugs or not paying taxes. All that. That's not even accounting for all that, or the whole, oh, they're heroes, blah 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 blah. But then they are just doing their jobs. You know what? They'll do whatever they're told. They'll say it. They'll say, hey, I don't make the laws. I just obey them." Yeah. So catch all the Jews or catch all the fugitive slaves. Round up all the Indians and make them live in the worst sections of land. Or yeah, like how are like is there any danger in that where you have a whole like a vast army of men who basically say they will do whatever they're told regardless, morality having nothing to do with it, as long as the government says it's okay, then it's okay. Again, for the people, for the tiny percentage that think that everything government does is syllogistically correct, that's not a problem. For anybody else who has any kind of moral compass that goes beyond assuming all government is correct all the time no matter what, that poses pretty serious problems. I mean, that's a pretty strong hazard. That's something that, oh, that could really be abused and something really bad could happen. Or minor things could happen, with great frequency that maybe aren't necessarily genocide, but they're still bad. They're still imposing costs that ruin people's lives. No, that's not really ever examined. Or the conceited view of, oh, they're there to protect you when they don't protect you, man. When there's a mass shooting, the cops don't jump in to stop. They huddle off in the corners like a whole bunch of fucking cowards, letting you get slaughtered. And then they have the gall to come out and be like, "You don't need a gun because we're out here to protect you. You're not qualified. We're the heroes." Blah 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 blah. Uh, they don't give two shits about you when it comes right down to it. They'll let you die. They'll let you be murdered. Um, like even when they're in a position like some of these mass shootings, they've been on site when they could have intervened and they don't. I mean, some of it's even bizarre. I've heard stories of people at Columbine's, like some of the officers trying to go in and they're told, "No, do not go in." It's like, what the fuck? Like like we've got all these people braying about how they're there to protect us and so we don't need to be, we don't have to take care of ourselves because they're out there. But then when the moment's right, when it's time to put up or shut up, then they don't do anything. But then they just come right back on the TV and claim victory and how great they are, how they served everyone even though they completely failed, even by their own standards. And I mean, mass shootings are very rare, so like that's not something you could call that an aberrant thing to not get particularly pissed about. But it's a pretty telling illustration. Of course, in that case, they're not necessarily to blame. Although if they're banning guns in certain areas, that's a part, and that's assuming that they don't actually orchestrate the events, which I don't know if that ever happens. I have suspicions that it might, but I can't prove it. If it does happen, though, it would be fairly rare, I think. In any event, yeah, I think this is a type of governmental abuse that can't be pawned off onto some other thing other than the inherent incentives within the institution. And that these abuses are, if anything, much worse than any of the other ones. You know, um, so anyway, good books, all of them. Uh, I think there is a bit of an echo chamber here. As libertarians, we end up with all our libertarian friends on social media, and whenever there's an abuse, it gets posted, and we all see it, and we're just hit with this constant deluge of these abuses, and it's like, okay, and we're very aware. Most people, they don't show this on the nightly news. The nightly news very rarely is going to talk about this, and all the fiction, all the dramas out there, the protagonists are police officers, and they're the heroes, and they're the great, they have whatever great outlook on humanity, and they're all just trying to fight for the little guy, and the bad people are always trying to thwart them, and blah, 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 blah. And this big fictitious lie that for some reason people internalize as being the truth. And then we have to have these stupid arguments, that they're altruistic and they're there to take care of us and they never do anything wrong. I mean, I was talking to a guy the other day, and he was like, "Oh no, like there's no such thing as voter fraud. Like that can't be. Like all the elections are perfectly clean and all," because they just believe they have to believe that it's this thing that's can't be that corrupt. That it can, maybe there's little abuses, but it can't systemically be wrong. It has to be good, right? So that's false. It can't be systemically wrong. It is. It's a terrible organization. Uh, Nothing that it does um, requires the abuses that it entails, and until someone can prove me otherwise, I don't see a reason to support something like that. So, all right.